I'd like to welcome you all who are listening. I'd like to welcome you to this opportunity to sit with Jack Zimmerman, who became one of my teachers about 26 years ago in this process, this practice that we call the Way of Counsel. And for those of you who might not be entirely familiar with Jack, he does hold a number of degrees, a BA, a MA, a PhD from Yale University, Harvard University, and the University of Southern California, respectively. He is the co-author with Virginia Coyle of The Way of Counsel, and he is also the co-author of Flesh and Spirit with his life partner, Jacqueline McCandless, and a number of other books as well. And so Jack has been with the organization that was called the Ojai Foundation for decades and is now known as TOPA. And he is someone who also has co-founded schools. He co-founded the Oakwood Secondary School in Los Angeles, and he started the Heartlight School in Los Angeles as well in 1979. And that's where counsel in the schools was initiated. So looking forward to hearing more about that story. And from there, with his work, he trained the trainers and the educators, and counsel spread far and wide, not only in schools in Los Angeles and California, but other parts of the United States and ultimately around the world. So welcome to you, Jack. And I just invite you to maybe share where you're sitting now. What part of the world are you in?
Well, thank you so much, Lori, for the invitation to do this and to be with you again. I mean, I really have missed our times together when we worked closely and for so many years. Right now, I'm sitting near a town called Honoka'a on the Big Island of Hawaii. And if you had told me 26 years ago, when we were together and met and started our journey, if you had told me I was going to end up here, I would have told you what and how and so forth. But I moved from New York, where I was born, to California for many, many years, and including all the years involved with Ojai. I was very much there at the beginning with Roshi Joan Halifax, beginning the Ojai Foundation, and now have seen it through its transition to TOPA and into the future, still doing the same kind of work that a large part of what we used to do. So I'm delighted to be here on the Big Island. It's an alive place, an active volcano, and two goddesses, the goddess Pele of the volcano, and then there's another goddess of this of the quiet volcano, Mauna Kea, that we live on the slopes of. And Poliahu is that goddess, much less well known, but so we're on land that still is growing. The Big Island grows every year because of the eruption of the volcano. So the whole notion of Aina, spiritual land, the spirituality of land, is deeply engrossed in the culture here, along with other traditions, indigenous traditions, which of course council is a representative of. So I feel very grounded here and very, very fortunate and grateful to be living here in the circumstances that I am. Yes.
And thank you, Jack. And what you speak of about being on a land that is growing reminds me of how the practice of counsel is growing and expanding. And I know that we'll touch upon that. that as you spoke about being at the Ojai Foundation in the earliest days with Joan Halifax and thinking about the Heartlight School, I wonder if you would speak a little bit to, either how you first found the way of counsel or how it found you.
Well, I think the second is much closer. And I think that's the way it is with most people. And I sometimes cannot believe, Heartlight started out in 1975, and it started out as a ragamuffin group of 13 young people who were whose families were courageous enough to join a brand new and very experimental school. And council found that school, and it's an interesting story. It's a story that begins the council book, but I'll give you a short version. And so this little school that started bringing counsel to children, it was really from a story. Counsel is about deep story. And the story that came to me was a story that my mother-in-law, my then mother-in-law, who visited Taos Pueblo frequently on her visits to us in California, when I was a young parent, doing my best to bring my life together and the life of the three children that we had rather quickly. And the story is a true story that took place way back in the 30s in Taos Pueblo. And it was the story of a council, a group of elders got together. And the reason they got together was because the US government at that point wanted to move them from where they were near Taos to some other place and have them reorganize their whole culture, even though the mountains in the area were sacred to the local people and all that. So they got together to decide what to do and how to respond. And the story was told by a grandson of one of the elders in that story. And my mother-in-law heard the grandson, when he was mature, tell the story. And briefly, what happened is a group of about 12, 13 elders, men who were chosen by the women in the culture, which is another interesting aspect of the indigenous tradition. They told stories. He sat there as a young, not experienced in the Native American tradition. He had gone to school in either Santa Fe or Albuquerque, I think. And so he didn't grow up in the Pueblo. So the men came in and they started telling stories. They didn't talk about the agenda. There was no vote. There was no discussion. There was no summary of what the government was proposing. But the stories were about the desert and what the desert meant there, the high desert. The stories were about the mountains and the water in that area and how sacred it was to them. And after everybody told a story about their connection, then they all looked at each other in silence. Everybody looked at everybody else in the eyes, which is one of the practices in council, in moments of silence. They looked at each other, they nodded, and they got up and left the kiva. And the young boy, I think he was about 11 or 12 at the time, he ran after his grandfather and said, "Oh, I thought this was a discussion." And the grandfather said, "Yes, it was. It was." And he was smiling, realizing his grandson had not really understood what happened. And he said, "Well, I thought you were going to discuss and then make a decision." He said, "We did." And as he began to explain to his grandson what had happened, the very essence of counsel came forward in such a deep way when I heard that story. And it just stayed with me deeply, like a dream that you've had that you will never forget. That's exactly what it was. And that dream was to remember that tradition, to remember, to literally bring it back into our bodies, into our hearts. And the morning where the school started, Heartlight started, I hadn't planned, anything about council. It was totally spontaneous. But what I did have was I had a big carob pod, which was sitting on a bookcase by the front door of where I lived. And somehow that carob pod leapt out at me as I opened the front door to drive in to meet the first day of school. And that carob pod I had found in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, and it was beautiful and had an S shape, and it was quite long, more than three feet long. And that became the talking piece for a council that morning. I remembered the story, took the talking piece. It's just incredible to me. And 13 children did council in a park in downtown LA. And now 50 years later, there are millions, literally, of children sitting in circle in Europe, in Israel, in Australia, and of course in America, particularly on the West and the East Coast, and particularly California. So that's how a story can change one's
Yeah.
life,
Yeah.
change the life. And it has really affected so many children and adults in the years since that story. And other people had similar experiences, It was time for the morphogenic field, for sure.
Mhm.
And now it is so desperately needed.
Yes.
This is the fulfillment, and people are turning to the practice now in a profound way all
Yes.
over the world.
So I hear that many people in that time dreamed the same dream, had a remembering, and the spontaneity that is one of the intentions of the practice led you to have that circle with those young people that day. And to think about how many years later it is, maybe some of those young people are now grandmother, grandfather, transmitting the practice to their grandchildren. And I think that this is, this is beautiful part of legacy. And I thank you for repeating that story. It's a beautiful one.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you, I think you've started to speak to it, but if you could share what is the way of counsel for you, and from what it was when you began, has it shifted for you over time?
Uh, say a little bit more about what aspect of that you want me to reflect on so I can choose the right stories.
Sure. So you were taken by this story that was relayed to you of the Taos Council. And so as you grabbed that carob pot and sat with those kids, this practice, this way of counsel kind of came to you. And in thinking about how you held it then, or maybe what the intentions of it in your practice were then, has that shifted over time? Do you still have that same relationship to the way of counsel? Does that
Uh,
resonate?
I got it. I got it now. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. On one level, the inspiration of that morning so many years ago is still beating in my heart. The feeling that people through story, through openness, could make decisions. I learned much later a very interesting part of American history, which is so relevant now, that in the when the early settlers interacted with the Native Americans in New England, the League of the Iroquois, they were amazed at the sophistication of the League and the leaders and how the different tribes came together and how they made decisions and the structure of their culture. And they adapted a very large part of what the League of the Iroquois were practicing, what we now call judicial, executive, and legislative branches of government. That whole shape, which is now so much under fire in
Mhm.
America. And then the other practice of council, which was deeply ingrained in the Iroquois tribes, that was so foreign to the Europeans who had fled to America that they didn't really understand. And so council was not taken on as a embrace of the form of government. And now that's what we need. Here now, many, many years later, over 250 years later, we're now in a situation where we need to really re-embrace the American structure, the American vision. The heart of democracy involves that deep communion and connection. So from the beginning, the school practice council, it began to spread to other schools, and then to public schools, and then, to other cities and other parts of the country, and to communities. And of course, Ojai was the center of it. And we became more and more functional with the practice. And this has always been a real challenge, is to respect the practice. In the traditional Native American tribal practices, almost all of them had, well, not almost all, but all had one form or another of council. And I learned over the years that every indigenous culture has a form of council. For example, in Hawaii, it's called a ho'oponopono, to make what is intrinsically real and right, to make that your life, to make that what you do and what you pursue. And that's really, and council is probably the oldest practice of communication for Homo sapiens. You can just imagine people coming together around the fire, cooking their food, and telling the stories of the day.
Mm.
And the practices are deeply ingrained in some Native American tribes. When a woman is pregnant, a group of women who are pregnant get together and they do counsel for their children to be, so that babies are actually in counsel before they're born. The
Mm.
fetus is actually born in counsel. And then
Yeah.
another story that is so familiar is about the second year, maybe it was even the third year of Heartlight, but I think it was the second year, a parent was visiting our day at Heartlight, and the day began with counsel. Every day began sharing dreams, sharing how people felt, sharing how they responded to, what was going on at school. And when the parents turned to me after the council was about half over and said, what are you doing? What is this? And I began to answer. And then, because I had been so moved by what the children had shared over the year or two before that, that I smiled and I turned to the children and I said, why don't you answer that question?
Mm.
That itself is the heart of counsel. That we really give children the voice, the sense that they're going to be listened to, that sense that they're going to be heard. To be heard as you grow up is the gift.
Yes.
And the children said what the intentions of counsel were. They didn't, formally call them intentions, but I'll never forget that morning, and the intentions evolved. Speaking from the heart, listening from the heart, being spontaneous, being really active in your listening, and learning to tell your story in a lean way.
Mm.
And that
Yeah.
really, that's life. I mean, if we can, we are a story in a certain way. And if we can really follow those and what it means.
Yes.
Yeah. And they use those words. Those were not words I made up.
I love that. I always heard that it was, being lean of expression, like when you trim the fat off a piece of meat.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But I'm also aware, Jack, that it is the heart of counsel, and it's not always just about not telling children, but inviting them to share. And it's the same for adults, right? We're not there as an expert to offer information or tell people what to do or how to do it, but we are there to elicit each person's story so that the wisdom of the whole, which is so much greater than each individual story, is allowed to come through. And I think that that is where, the ability to have this sort of decision making through story, that the respect is there, that the heart melts.
Uh,
No one person knows the way, but we know the way together.
Indeed. Indeed. It's the very essence of what's potential in the human condition. And it's so important to remember that this practice has evolved over tens of thousands of years, but it is an old practice. It came as human consciousness emerged more and more. Council was the place where that dance took place, where that understanding. And so, yes, decision making, conflict resolution, co-creation, so many different ways in which council becomes the context for living. And
Hmm.
and in recent years, I've come to look at human consciousness in an evolutionary way, as so many people have. And when you have a practice which is ancient, and you are respectfully bringing that practice into contemporary culture, what you're doing is not imitating an indigenous culture. We're not going back. We're going on, and we're learning how to stimulate and invite and activate the indigenuity. I made up a new word in recent times in order to be able to describe this, to be able to evoke the indigenuity of the human condition, because children have not forgotten it. They get trained out of it by the structure of some of our cultural practices and education, but it's inherent. It's inherent in the human condition. And so
Hmm.
I talk about counsel as a major practice in making the transition, which is so important evolutionarily now, from what I've come to call the mind heart into the heart mind. The mind heart, which has served us evolutionarily in so many ways, a loving, mindful presence. But the mind, the thoughts still come from the cultural and individualistic aspects of us in many ways. And that's what we're struggling with. Whereas the mind of the heart mind serves the heart.
Hmm.
The heart mind is sort of like the lover of the heart in a
Hmm.
deep, intimate relationship. And that's totally different. The
Hmm.
nature of the imagination is different as we evolve. The nature of thought itself, feelings produce thought in the heart mind. It's not always thought producing feeling as we become more used to in the mind heart. And there's nothing wrong with the mind heart. It's just that we need to evolve now to be able to also encourage the presence of the heart mind so that we can once again be in one huge circle of billions of people in some way. That's the challenge right now, clearly.
Oh, yes. And, you're, of course, taking my mind off into many roads. And one of them is thinking about the mind heart, we are developing artificial intelligence, and that is a mind place. That is a place that can do so many of these functions that got us this modern world that we're living in. But what it cannot do is replicate the heart mind, which is the relationship of human to human and the place of the imagination and the creative place. And now we really do need to focus on the heart mind.
We do indeed. We do indeed. And we need to focus on it with very young children. We need to focus on it in our parenting and, of course, in every aspect of our culture. And
Mm-hmm,
to learn more about it, to learn the nature of thought that's inspired by feelings, deep feelings.
mm-hmm,
And in counsel, you feel the collective wisdom of the circle. Even in two people counsel, even in dyadic counsel, there is a presence which Jacqueline and I came to call third presence. There's a presence in the intimate relationship, which is much more than the sum total of the presence of the partners. And that presence changes your whole perception of reality. That presence makes you focus, helps you, invites you to focus on relational connection. Whether you walk
mm-hmm,
into a room and sense what's going on in the room, whether you're sitting and having a deep conversation with one other person trying to resolve some differences. When you speak from that place, the feeling of connection comes through. The
mm-hmm,
history, even if the history is polarized, as it is in the Middle East right now, for example, that polarization can disappear. There are colleagues of mine now, old friends, and many people in Israel now, despite what's going on in that part of the world, who are bringing counsel to more and more people, to elders, to wise circles of women, particularly right now.
mm-hmm.
And counsel has a quality of honoring the divine feminine in a very strong way. It's a horizontal kind of leadership. It's not vertical, which the patriarchy has more or less honored. And we're moving now. We're beginning to move now into more circle leadership, hopefully.
Well, there's backlash, and that backlash doesn't take away from the overall movement and need for that movement to the heart mind, the relational way, the circle way of being together. It's just maybe pointing out how much that is needed.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Jack, you were engaged in this practice with the children and then others wanted it. How did you first come to start training others? How did you transmit the practice?
Well, I did a few trainings after the experience at Heartlight and then a few other independent schools. We formed a council of school leaders in Los Angeles. It was called New Visions of Education. I'm still in touch with a few of those people. It's just incredible. And some of them were headmasters or headmistresses of schools. Some of them have started many schools over the years with counsel as an intrinsic part of it. And of course, what happened then is the kids brought counsel home from school, so the parents began to understand it, and then it began to appear. Finally, in the 90s, early 1990s, it began to appear in public schools. So then the adult community began to understand it. And of course, it began to spread organically in community. Ojai Youth Council and all of its board meetings, we always began with a council so everybody could say where they were and how they were feeling. And if you know how people are feeling, it changes how you do business. The sterile nature of deep heartfulness in American economy is not necessary. It's not implicit in the economic model. There can be, many companies have explored counsel over the years and really taken it in their human resources. And there's one company now that everybody is very connected to, Snap, where they're doing counsel internally and sharing it with their people they serve, the other organizations they serve, and of course they serve children too. And right now we're working out programs where we can accent the way in which children use the digital world in a way that perhaps can bring counsel in that way. So it spread to community. That was its organic nature because that's really how it arose in the beginning. It arose as a community practice. And then, I've had wild experiences. I brought counsel to a car dealership in Phoenix, Arizona, the last place in the world where you would think, very competitive. And we used a little model car for our talking piece. The choice of the talking piece can often have a lot of wisdom and humor and playfulness to help people really risk the vulnerability and the openness that counsel offers. So it went from community to business to relationship. It became so much a part of the deep, intimate work. And the whole notion of relational consciousness began to arise. And when a group of people do the practice, a group of couples, they learn from each other. Intimate relationship became so isolated. People could only talk to their partner. And yet there are so many common threads in relationships. So as a counselor, I essentially do counsel in my sessions. I'm not there to give advice. I'm there to listen to the dreaming, to listen to the stories, and reflect in the same way that is natural and organic in counsel. So if advice comes, it comes out of the wisdom of many, many stories. That's at the heart of indigenuity.
Yes, it is so isolating to be a nuclear family, to try to get all your needs met with one person, to not have others to talk to about what you're experiencing, and easy to feel alone in it. And similarly with our struggles, our deep struggles in parenting, uh, to be able to sit in a circle of couples is of astonishing value.
Yeah, really astonishing. I had a recent experience which I would like to share. I've become part of a council circle of educators from all over the country under the banner of reimagining education. The distinction between the imagination of the mind-heart and the heart-mind is profound. When the imagination of the mind-heart functions, comes up creatively, then there's a step to manifest what the imagination has invited into the thought process, into the neurological system of the group or the few people who have the idea. The imagination of the heart mind is much more in the manifest world. When you get an idea, it's like it exists because it's not from the mental memory or process or past, but it's something from the moment. It's something that a whole range of feelings may have created. And in living in a community which uses counsel, you have the experience again and again of having a group come together, not be clear about what they want to do as a collective, have the imagination of the circle, which is a model for the heart mind, then come up with something. And when the people walk out of the room, it exists. And
Mm,
yes, of course, there's manifestation and implementation, but it has a different feeling. And right now, that is extremely important. If a group of leaders could get together and do deep counsel, all the different negotiating, all the kind of negotiation that we have become familiar with changes.
yes,
I've seen this in the Middle
yes,
East in situations, working with the Jewish and Arab leaders, um, and seeing how the practice actually brings them together in ways that they could not have imagined in a few
yes.
days gathering together.
There's
So,
something that arises, that emerges, which is different than the argumentation that
yeah,
is involved in most sort of gatherings that you speak of.
exactly. Yeah. So
Yes,
we don't hold our positions. The fundamental intention is to serve the heart, to serve connecting, to
hmm,
serve interdependence, to serve the reality of our interdependence. And as the world gets more and more interdependent, this becomes more and more of a challenge. If we don't do it, then we see the absurdities of what happened, the nightmare of absurdities that can
hmm,
happen. And so perhaps that's what's happening now. That's what some of us hope is what's happening, is to see the darkness so, so clearly that there's some light of awareness and a willingness to take a turn in what Joanna Macy calls the great turning.
yes. What is needed at this time to feel safe enough to connect?
Right. Exactly.
Beautiful. And so, what is it that you might wish for if you were to place a prayer, if it even works that way? What do you wish for this practice as it goes forward? And I think you were speaking about it, in a way in your last response, to have people really see um, that there are options for how we come together, how we interact together. And if you'd like to say a little bit more about what you wish for the practice going forward, and how that might relate to legacy for you as someone
Uh-huh.
who you know co-authored the way of counsel, and has dedicated so much of your life to transmitting the practice, and to being so open about its shape shifting and how it's moving out in the world.
Mhm. Well, I trust, since it's moving out in so many ways, and I'm aware of some of the large corporations, for example, that SNAP serves in one way or another. I'm aware of how things can grow in unexpected ways. I remember many, many years ago meeting with the CEO of SNAP in council, Evan, and we met in the house that he grew up in. So the kitchen table, where the idea of creating the corporation that he's now the CEO of, was just 10 feet from where we were sitting, in Southern California. It was just an incredible couple-hour counsel with him. He was about to be married then and become a father, because the woman he was marrying already had a child. And he said, I want to have a community in this corporation. I want it to be a community. And so I've been connected with them since the beginning, and working with people who are bringing counsel into the corporation and into the corporation's work. So part of what I would envision is that the economic culture of the world would begin to embrace counsel in a profound way. And through that communication, the spiritual part of life and what we have called the secular part of life would be no longer in any way separated. The separation of our spiritual life from our daily cultural life has been a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it has served up to a certain point for many, many people. And now that integration is really essential. So I think it's important that it come into the economy. That's one very strong way. And I'm doing everything I can to support that, primarily in my connection with SNAP. The other major frontier, of course, is education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have never been in more profound councils than kindergarten.
Oh.
The conversation about life and death, the conversation about fear, the conversation about who am I, the essence of not knowing that practice and how important that practice is now, often arises with very young children. I used to have the feeling that if people did counsel in corporations and communities and everything, they should at least spend one semester doing counsel with children because there's so much to learn, the
Yes.
whole attitude of education, to bring out of the children their wisdom and their fears and their desires, and is so, so important. So if the frontier of counsel in the economy and in education can really become present, as in the story that you asked me to share, I think we can make the turning.
Mm.
It's more than hopeful. It's a kind of there's no other path. There are other ways of defining counsel. There are other practices other people have spontaneously. I believe counsel is now arising, to use Rupert Sheldrake's terminology, as a resonant field, as morphogenic resonance. It's arising in different places spontaneously. We don't have to be missionaries in order to do that because it's indigenous in our beingness.
And that indigeneity brings the necessity of it, and the necessity of it brings the hope. And I hear in your words the essential wholeness. Counsel is affirming of wholeness, whether it is bringing the material and the spiritual together, whether it's maintaining that wholeness that the kindergarten child has that can get stripped away, but as a way of preserving, of holding, and cultivating that fullness. So can I ask just a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay. What has the practice taught you?
Ooh. That's a long list. I think I'm drawn to the practice because I wanted to learn to really listen. I realized, as the practice took me deeper into listening and the counseling work that I have done, and even when I was working in a corporate setting and doing research and so forth in the early days after graduate school, I began to realize what was really important. And that was really important was to really not hear what people say, but to really take in. So the expression that the children came up with, listening from the heart, is very real. It's not a metaphor. It's not a New Age metaphor. The heart has the capacity to take in what's being said energetically, of course, through the ears verbally, but it can take it in a way that connects you, the very process of listening itself can connect. And so I began to realize what was possible in relationship, in parenting, in running a community like Ojai, for example. We again and again learned that decision making unfolds organically when people are listening. So what I learned was to listen. I learned to what I now call the beginnings of the birth of the heart mind. I learned to work on abolishing individualism. You know, historically, we went through a period from the Middle Ages until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We went through a period where the individual was extremely important. And I don't find any inconsistency between that and the nature of counsel. But it's a different vision. And it's exactly that difference that we're struggling with right now.
Mhm.
There's individualism, but there's the birth of the individual in the context. And that's what's real. Evolution is real. You know, and the survival of the fittest now is going to be whatever language you want to use, the ability to function in circle, whatever, whether it's two people in a family or a family of 5 or 6, or whether it's a company, whether it's leaders from different countries, to function in that context, in that sensitivity, is an evolutionary step. So the survival of the fittest is the growth of the heart mind. Not who's stronger, not who speaks louder, not who has more power. You know, where we've come to in America right now makes that so clear. The balance of what the shamanic world called the large body is essential if the body is going to be healthy. And if parts of the body are dominant and other parts are not recognized even, then the body is out of balance. It's not basically healthy. So to me, that's really the vision, you know, every breath. And I started telling you a story about these educators. Let me finish the story because it's relevant to your question. I decided with this group, for a variety of reasons, not to introduce counsel formally or in any kind of missionary way. In the early days, I was very missionary, and I had to take a breath and, you know, not have counsel, what we used to call counsel fundamentalism.
Great.
Now you can fall in love with it, what you think is working, and that's not heart mind. That's more mind heart. Anyway, I just subtly brought in, you know, a comment or a question. I mentioned the Lakota medicine wheel of worthy adversaries one time, and about 3 months later, this group said, "Hey, what did you mean about what was that about?" You know, and the medicine wheel teachings, of course, are intrinsically counsel oriented because of the nature of the circle and moving around the circle. So slowly, the people asked me to introduce something, comment on something. Finally, there was a whole meeting where we did counsel about what was concerning the people about the group, what they hadn't said to each other. And this was a very emancipated people who were progressive and
High
very,
functioning,
yeah,
high
high
functioning
functioning,
people.
yeah.
Mhm.
And now counsel has been absorbed, you know, not so much as a formal practice, but the whole spirit of it, the whole listening, the willingness to share disagreements in the spirit of what is the circle's wisdom? Where are we going? And so whatever we do with education then has that flavor. So if teachers work together, there's nothing in some schools more isolating than a teacher and his or her classroom.
Mhm.
You know, it's sort of like a little kingdom or queendom.
Mhm.
So the council is very important, all the way from how you arrange the chairs in the room to how you teach, quote, or mentor.
Mhm.
The word education has become what do you make sure the kids know? What do you put down into their minds? And the word education, if you look at the Latin roots, is to draw out of. And so that can change a lot. And if the idea of a group of leaders sitting down is to draw out the best heartful wisdom, then it's much more likely that something is going to happen dramatically rather than in the very painful and sometimes not happening way that we're experiencing now.
Mm. So I'm taking away that the archetype of the circle, the wisdom in that way of being together is one that cultivates the heart mind. And that is the avenue forward in our evolution.
Yes. And our sense of uniqueness is in the circle. It seems like a paradox. Uniqueness has said, oh, I'm different, better, I get grades that are better, all that kind of stuff. But the uniqueness, my experience of that part of that aspect of each individual grows in council. It's not paradox.
No, no,
The circle is the garden in which the individual plant, the whatever it is, has that growth, and the more variety there is, the better.
right. The individuation happens, and then the realization of what you do with that is to return to wholeness.
Exactly. I'm
Yeah.
glad you used that word because it's individualism being replaced by individuation, to
Mhm.
use Jung's term. And Jung
Mhm.
knew this.
He did. Yes.
Jung knew this in his revolutionary psychological approach. And one reason he and Freud finally parted company was because Jung had that spiritual aspect of, individuality not being separating, but being bringing people together to celebrate their connection with the earth and with the
Yes.
heavens and with the mystery of the divine.
Yes. Well, that seems like a beautiful place to complete a conversation that could extend for hours more. Is
Indeed.
there anything else that you would like to share about this beautiful practice?
Well, what comes up just now, looking at you, is my heart is full of being with you.
Oh,
This is such fun, and even though it was on one hand an interview, it felt like a reconnection, and that's part of the circle.
mhm,
People are reaching out now as I get older and saying, "I want to be in circle with you again." I want to hear the story again, and it's a different feeling. And I wonder at the end of life whether what we can potentially move into as we leave this body this time for this transient period, I wonder whether there is some sense of the great circle, some sense of the great connectability and interdependence that
mhm,
is part of what we can move into. And if that is possible, evolution, even though things look so challenging now, I think evolution is can continue, and we
mhm,
can not so much only hope, but practice that which will be real. The heart mind is real.
mhm. Yes. And I would say the heart mind extends beyond the veil.
Indeed. Indeed. So thank you so much, dear. I really appreciated this. It was a
Thank
treasure.
you. Thank you, Jack. It is a treasure, and I know it will be for folks who do get to hear these stories that in your voice. and your beautiful voice. So I thank you so much. Um,
So,
do I say mahalo?
mahalo nui loa.
That's it.
I love the language. Yeah.